Thank you all for coming out today. My name is Denise Ozier. I'm the Community Partnership Coordinator and the Adult Programming Manager for the Gwinnett County Public Library System, and I welcome you on the behalf of our Director. We are pleased to have you here today, and what we're going to do, just so that you're comfortable and know what the afternoon looks like, is we're going to introduce our two authors. They're going to speak and take questions for about an hour, and then at that point, we're going to have a signing line. I've tried to let you all know through our signage what our rules are, because they do need to leave the building by 5, so we do have to be respectful of that, and we want you all to have a chance to meet them. So it's first names only for your books. We'll help you with sticky notes and so on. We will have someone right here on stage to take your camera and photograph you leaning in. We're not going to do posing, please, because if we do, some of you won't. We just don't have time. So we've taken care of that for you. We thank Eagle Eye Books, who is responsible for selling these books and who donates a percentage of your sales back to the library. So thank you for supporting our bookseller. Yes. The authors won't keep coming the way they have, folks, if we don't support that bookstore. So we are grateful. We're grateful to the Friends of the Library who have taken care of your refreshments today. The man that's going to introduce the Congressman and Aydin is Councilman and Mayor Pro Tem Craig Newton. He has served 9 years on the council. He was the president of the Gwinnett Municipal Association. He served on the Gwinnett County Commissioners Board of Directors, the Norcross Downtown Development Authority, and he currently serves on the Gwinnett Transit Advisory Board. We thank the City of Norcross for this beautiful venue, and we'd like to introduce you to Craig Newton.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
I'd like to welcome you to Norcross, a place to imagine. I'm going to take a bit of personal privilege and just acknowledge my mayor, Bucky Johnson. And thank you, Gwinnett Library System, for choosing Norcross. When I was asked to do the introduction, I felt that it was not just a pleasure, but an honor to introduce our two special guests, and I'll get right to that. First guest, Andrew Aydin. Andrew is Digital Director and Policy Advisor for Congressman Lewis in Washington, D.C. After college, he took a job with Congressman Lewis and learned that the civil rights legend had been inspired as a young man by a classic 1950s comic book, Martin Luther King and the Montgomery Story. They discussed the impact that comic books can have on young readers and decided to write a graphic novel together about the civil rights era a few years later. The March series was then born. As March has grown into an award-winning phenomenon, Andrew continues to publish and lecture about the history of comics in the civil rights movement. Together with artist Nate Powell, the three creators have turned the life of an exceptional human being into both a work of literature and a work of art. Help me welcome Andrew Aydin. Our next guest actually needs no introduction, but by way of formality, I'm just going to go through the exercise. United States Representative Congressman John Lewis is the U.S. representative for Georgia's 5th Congressional District and is an American icon known for his role in the civil rights movement. He joined the movement as a seminary student in Nashville, organizing sit-ins and participating in the first Freedom Rides. He became the chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. Congressman Lewis was one of the big 6 national leaders of the movement, along with such figures as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and A. Philip Randolph. He was the architect of the 1963 March on Washington and was a key figure in the 1964 Mississippi Freedom Summer. He led the landmark Bloody Sunday March in Selma, one that's indelibly etched in all of our hearts and our minds. Congressman Lewis has served 25 years in Congress and was awarded the 2010 Presidential Medal of Freedom. In addition to the John F. Kennedy Profile in Courage Lifetime Achievement Award. Now, in collaboration with Andrew Aydin and Nate Powell, he has created March, a #1 New York Times best-selling series of graphic novels, winning honors from the National Book Awards. Help me to welcome, at this time, Congressman John Lewis.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. You're a beautiful, handsome group. Mr. Mayor, Mr. Mayor Pro Tem, to each and every one of you members of the Gwinnett Library System, friends, just wonderful people, let me tell you that I'm delighted, very happy, and very pleased to be here. To be here with Andrew Aydin, known this young man for a while. He's been on my staff for more than 10 years, along with Nate Powell, the artist. They become like two sons, or we're more like brothers. I didn't grow up in a big city like Norcross, or Decatur, or Atlanta. I grew up in rural Alabama, 50 miles from Montgomery, outside of a little place called Troy. My father was a sharecropper, a tenant farmer. But back in 1944, when I was 4 years old, and I do remember when I was 4. How many of you remember when you were 4? Oh, that's pretty good. What happened to the rest of us? Well, back in 1944, my father had saved $300. And a man sold him 110 acres of land. My family still owns this land today. On this farm, we raised a lot of cotton and corn, peanuts, hogs, cows, and chicken. If you read March, and especially March Book 1, on that farm, it was my responsibility to care for the chickens. And I fell in love with raising chickens. Now, any of you know anything about raising chicken? I know some of you like to eat chicken. You know anything about raising chicken? Okay, and one brother there, sister there, and sister there, oh, brother here, sister there, sister there. Okay, good, good. So some of you know something about raising chicken. Why don't we compare notes? Well, growing up there as a little boy, when the setting hen was set, had to take the fresh eggs, mark them with a pencil, place them under the setting hen, and wait for 3 long weeks for the little chicks to hatch. Some of you may be saying, now, John Lewis, why do you mark those fresh eggs with a pencil before you place them under the setting hen? Well, from time to time, another hen would get on that same nest, and there would be some more fresh eggs. And you had to be able to tell the fresh eggs from the eggs that were already under the setting hen. Do you follow me? That's okay. You don't follow me. It's all right. So when the little chick would hatch, I would fool these setting hens. I would cheat on these setting hens. I would take these little chicks and give them to another hen, or put them in a box with a lantern and raise them on their own, get some more fresh eggs, mark them with a pencil, place them under the setting hen, encourage the setting hen to stay in the nest for another 3 weeks. When I look back on it, it was not the right thing to do. It was not the moral thing to do. It was not the most loving thing to do. It was not the most nonviolent thing to do. It was not the most democratic thing to do. But I just kept on cheating on these setting hens. I was never quite able to save $18.98 to order the most inexpensive incubator or hatcher from the Susan Roebuck store. And then you remember the Susan Robert Kellogg? Are you old enough to remember? Yeah. Really? You really do? Yeah. Don't fool me. Don't play with me. That big book, heavy book, right? So it's a thick book. Some people call it the wish book. I wish I had this. I wish I had that. So I just kept on wishing. But I kept on cheating on these setting hens. As a little child, about 9 years old, I wanted to be a minister. I wanted to preach the gospel. So from time to time, we would gather all of our chickens together in the chicken yard, like you gather here in this hall. And we would have church. My brothers and sisters and cousins would line the outside, but around the chicken yard. And I started speaking or preaching, and I noticed some of the chickens would bow their heads. Some of the chickens would shake their heads. They never quite said amen. But I'm convinced that some of those chickens that I preached to in the 40s and the 50s tended to listen to me much better than some of my colleagues listened to me today in the Congress. As a matter of fact, some of the chicken was just a little more productive. At least they produce say, well, that's enough of that story. Don't tell any of my colleagues I said this about them, okay? But growing up there, when we visit the little town of Troy, visit Montgomery, visit Tuskegee, I saw those signs that said, white men, white women, colored women, white waiting, colored waiting. I would come home and ask my mother, ask my father, my grandparents, my great-grandparents why. They were, that's the way it is. Don't get in the way. Don't get in trouble. Or to go downtown on a Saturday afternoon to the theater. All of us little black children had to go upstairs to the balcony. All of the little white children went downstairs to the first floor. I kept on saying, why? And my mother would say, boy, don't get in trouble. Don't get in the way. And sometime I would be out there working in the field, gathering peanuts, pulling corn, picking cotton. My mother would say, boy, you're falling behind. You need to catch up. You're falling behind. And I would say, this is hard work. And she would say, hard work never killed anybody. I said, well, it's about to kill me. So as a little child, I was determined to get an education, determined to go to school. So some morning I would get up very, very early with my book bags and my few papers and books in my book bag and hide under the front porch and wait for the school bus to come up the hill. And I would run out and get on that school bus and go off to school. Growing up there as a young child, 15 years old in the 10th grade, I heard of Rosa Parks. I heard the words of Martin Luther King Jr. on our radio. The words of Dr. King and his leadership inspired me. I read about Dr. King. I read about Rosa Parks. We were too poor to have a subscription to the local newspaper called the Montgomery Advertiser. The Montgomery Advertiser was maybe to Alabama what the Constitution is to Georgia. But my grandfather would pass his paper on to us each day after he read it. And so I kept up with the drama of Montgomery and what was going on around the South. When I finished high school in May of 1957 at the age of 17, I wanted to attend a little college 10 miles from my home called Troy State College, now known as Troy University. Submitted my application, my high school transcript. I never heard a word from the school. So I wrote a letter to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I didn't tell my mother, my father, any of my sisters or brothers, any of my teachers. I told Dr. King I needed his help. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote me back and sent me a round-trip Greyhound bus ticket and invited me to come to Montgomery to meet with him. In the meantime, I applied to a little school in Nashville, Tennessee, called American Baptist Theological Seminary, now known as American Baptist College. An uncle of mine gave me a $100 bill, more money than I ever had. Gave me a Foot Locker. I put everything that I own, my few books, my few clothing, in that Foot Locker, except those chickens, and took a Greyhound bus to Nashville, Tennessee. And after being in Nashville for about 3 weeks, I told one of my teachers that I'd been in contact with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And this teacher told Dr. King that I was in Nashville, so Dr. King got back in church with me and suggested when I was home for spring break to come and see him. So in March of 1958, by this time I'm 18 years old, I boarded a Greyhound bus from Troy and traveled to Montgomery. A young lawyer by the name of Fred Gray, who was a lawyer for Rosa Parks and Dr. King and became our lawyer during the Freedom Ride and during the march from Selma to Montgomery, met me at the Greyhound bus station and drove me to the First Baptist Church in downtown Montgomery, passing by the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, and ushered me into the office of the church. And I saw Martin Luther King Jr. and Ralph Abernathy standing behind the desk. I was so scared, I didn't know what to say or what to do. And Dr. King said, "Oh, you John Lewis? Oh, you the boy from Troy?" And I said, "Dr. King, I am John Robert Lewis." He gave my whole name. I wanted him to be sure that I was the right person. He said, "If you continue to try to enter Troy State, now known as Troy University," he said, "your family can lose their land, their home could be bombed or burned, but if you really want to go there, we will help you, we will assist you." I went back and had a discussion with my mother and my father. They were so afraid they didn't want to have anything to do with my effort to enter Troy State College. So I continued to study in Nashville, and it was in Nashville that high school students and college students came together from Fisk University, Peabody College, Vanderbilt University, Fisk University, Tennessee State, Harvard Medical School, and we started studying the way of peace, the way of love, studying the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence. We would be sitting in lunch counters, restaurants, at the Greyhound bus station, the Trailway bus station, and someone would come up and spit on us, or put a lighted cigarette out in our hair, or down our backs, pour hot water, hot coffee, hot chocolate on us. And one day we heard that if we continued to sit in, we would be arrested. I'd never been arrested before, but we had been trained to be prepared to be arrested, to go to jail. I wanted to look for some young people here, maybe not some of you too young, but maybe some older people. Remember when people would say, "Look fresh, look clean, look sharp"? Well, I wanted a new suit. So I had very little money, so I went to a used men's store in downtown Nashville, and I bought this used suit, and it fitted me well. A vest came with it. I paid $5 for it. If I had that suit today, I probably can sell it on eBay for a lot of money. but I don't know what happened to the suit. And this young man here, who's so smart and so gifted, he did a little research, and he located a photograph that appeared on the front page of the Nashville Tennessean, the local newspaper, with me with that suit on. So if you come to Washington and visit my congressional office, you'll see a photograph of me in this suit being arrested, and I do look good. But the first time I got arrested and went to jail, I felt free. I felt liberated. I felt like I crossed over. So we tell this story in March, Book 1. And then we went on something called the Freedom Ride. Just think, in 1961, the same year that President Barack Obama was born, black people and white people can be seated together on a Greyhound bus, or a Trailway bus, leaving Washington, D.C. to travel through Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. We were on our way to New Orleans to test a decision of the United States Supreme Court. On May 4th, 1961, 13 of us, the original Freedom Riders, that were 21 years old, we went through training. We were prepared to be arrested and go to jail. We arrived in a little town called Rock Hill, South Carolina, about 35 miles from Charlotte, North Carolina. My seatmate was a young white gentleman. The two of us tried to enter a so-called white waiting room, and a group of men attacked us and left us lying in a pool of blood. This is May 1961. In February '08, one of the gentlemen came to my office. He was in his 70s, with a son in his 40s, and he said, "Mr. Lewis, I've been a member of the Klan. I'm one of the people that beat you and your seatmate. Will you accept my apology? Will you forgive me?" His son started crying. He started crying. And I said, I forgive you, I accept your apology. They hugged me. I hugged them back, and I started crying. It is the power of the way of peace, the way of love, the power of the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence. I saw the gentleman 4 other times. All across the South, people started sitting in bus station and train station, but it led to the desegregation of public transportation all across America. So now, people can take a seat any place. You have the money to buy the ticket. It's okay. So it doesn't matter whether you're black or white, Latino, Asian American, or Native American. The late Philip Randolph said when we were planning the March on Washington in 1963, he would say over and over again, our foremothers and our forefathers all came to this great land in different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. And I think that is true even today. After the sit-ins, the freedom rides, we turned to the whole area of gaining the vote. In many parts of the Deep South, it was hard and difficult for people to register to vote. In the 11 states of the old Confederacy, from Virginia to Texas, people had to pay a poll tax, interpret certain section of the Constitution of the state of Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, or Louisiana. On one occasion, in some places in my native state of Alabama, people were asked to count the number of bubbles in a bar of soap, the number of jelly beans in a jar. There were college professors, teachers, lawyers, and doctors been told they could not read or write well enough. When I spoke at the March on Washington on August 28, 1963, I said, one man, one vote. And we did all we could to get that included in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I was the youngest speaker at the March on Washington. And I was 23 years old. And out of the 10 people that spoke that day, I'm the only one still around. But on that day, after the march was all over, President Kennedy invited us down to the White House, stood in the door of the Oval Office, greeting each one of us. He was beaming like a proud father that everything had gone so well. And he said to each one of us, you did a good job, you did a good job. And when he got to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he said, you did a good job and you had a dream. That was my last time seeing President Kennedy. There was so much hope, so much optimism. We lost him when he was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. President Lyndon Johnson did everything possible to get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed in memory of President Kennedy. But we turned our attention to the right to vote, went into places in Mississippi, Alabama, other parts of the South. The state of Alabama, part of the Black Belt, only a few people of color were registered to vote. There was one county between Selma and Montgomery called Lowndes County. It was more than 80% African American. There was not a single registered African American voter in the county. In the county where Selma is located, only 2.1% of blacks of voting age were registered to vote. We had to change that. We had gone into Mississippi, and I will never forget that during the summer of 1964, 3 young men that I knew, Andy Goodman, Micah Scherner, white, James Shaney, African American, went out on summer night, June 21st, 1964, to investigate the burning of an African American church, a little Methodist church, to be used for voter registration workshop. They were stopped by the sheriff, arrested, taken to jail, later taken out of the jail that same night, turned over to the Klan, where they were beaten, shot, and killed. These 3 young men didn't die in Vietnam. They didn't die in the Middle East or Eastern Europe or in Africa or Central or South America. They died right here in our country. That was a sad and dark hour for the movement. Hundreds of students, young people, black and white, Latino, Asian American, and Native American, came south to work. Lawyers, doctors, rabbis, priests, and others to work in the movement. They didn't like what they saw happening. But in 1965, a group of us working in Selma, Alabama, decided to march in an orderly, peaceful, nonviolent fashion. Our Constitution protects people when they want to protest in an orderly, peaceful, nonviolent fashion. We line up in twos to walk in an orderly manner 50 miles from Selma to Montgomery. I was wearing a backpack before it became fashionable to wear backpacks. In that backpack, I had one apple and one orange. I thought we were going to be arrested and go to jail, so I wanted to have something to eat. I had a toothpaste and toothbrush. Since I was going to be in jail, I thought with my friends and neighbors, I wanted to be able to brush my teeth. I had 2 books to read in jail. Walking beside Jose Williams, in an orderly, peaceful, nonviolent fashion. We had just left a little Methodist church called Brown Chapel AME Church. No one saying a word as we crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, but Jose Williams said to me when we were crossing the bridge, "John, can you swim?" And I said, "Yes, a little." I said, "What about you, Jose?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Well, there's too much water down there. We're not going to jump." We continued to walk, just orderly, peaceful. We get to the highest point on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Down below, we saw a sea of blue, Alabama State Troopers. And behind the state troopers, we saw Sheriff Clark, Jim Clark, with the sheriff of Dallas County and Selma, with his posse. Sheriff Clark was wearing a button that said "never" on his left lapel. We get within hearing distance of the state troopers, a man identified himself. Said, "Now, Major John Cloud of the Alabama State Troopers, this is an unlawful march, will not be allowed to continue. I give you 3 minutes to disperse and return to your homes or to your church." And Jose Williams said, "Major, give us a moment to kneel and pray." The major said, "Troopers, advance." I said, "Major, may I have a word?" He said, "There will be no word." You saw these men putting on a gas mask. They came toward us, beating us with nightsticks, trampling us with horses, and releasing the tear gas. I was the first one to be hit. I was hit in the head by a state trooper with a nightstick. My legs went from under me. I thought I was going to die. I thought I saw death. But somehow, in some way, I guess a group of people literally carried me back to the little church. And during that time, there were more than 2,000 people on the outside trying to get into this little church to protest what had happened. And someone asked me to say something to the audience. And I stood up and said something like, "I don't understand it. How President Johnson can send troops to Vietnam and cannot send troops to Selma, Alabama to protect people who only desires to register to vote." And the next thing I knew, I'd been admitted to the Good Samaritan Hospital, where a group of nuns took care of 17 of us. That Monday morning, early that Monday morning, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. came to Selma and came by to visit me in my hospital room. And said, "John, don't worry, we will make it from Selma to Montgomery." He said, "I've asked ministers, priests, rabbis, nuns, religious leaders to come to Selma." On that following Tuesday, more than 1,000 religious leaders came to Selma to march across the bridge. That evening, 3 ministers were attacked. One was so severely beaten they were rushed to a hospital in Birmingham and later died. But President Johnson was so moved and so disturbed about what happened, he called Governor Wallace to come to Washington to meet with him. Governor Wallace could not assure the president that he would be able to protect us. We decided to march again. We went into federal court, and the federal judge issued an order that we had a right to march in an orderly, peaceful fashion. So President Johnson called out part of the United States military to protect us on our 5-day war. and I will never forget it. It was like a march in such a fashion that people were so determined to make it there, to show the world that we could have a successful, orderly, peaceful, nonviolent protest. But on that day when Lyndon Johnson spoke, he said, "I speak tonight for the dignity of man and for the destiny of democracy." He introduced the Voting Rights Act. In a few weeks or months, the Voting Rights Act was passed and signed into law on August 6, 1965. And I was there. President Johnson gave me one of the pens that he used to sign the act, and I'm giving this pen to the new African American Museum of History and Culture located on the Mall in Washington. So we're coming distant. We made a lot of progress. Our country is a much better country. March, tell the story, but it's a book of hope about where we've been and where we're going. March, book 1, book 2, book 3. And Andrew would tell you how people are reading it and sharing the stories all over America and around the world. Thank you for being here, your beautiful, handsome-looking group. And thank you for bringing all of the young people. Thank you. And let me, now, Andrew is a native of Georgia, born here, not too far from here. And Andrew, it's all yours, son.
How do you follow that? My name's Andrew Aydin. I serve as Digital Director and Policy Advisor in the Congressman's Congressional Office in D.C. I was actually born and raised not too far from here. My mother was raised off Metropolitan Avenue. My grandmother was raised down in Hapeville. But my father was a Turkish immigrant. My father was a Muslim. And if I'm totally honest, I never knew him. He left when I was about 3 years old. And perhaps the single defining characteristic of my childhood is being raised by a single mother. I think all too many of us in this room know the challenges that single mothers face, in particular, raising a child in Georgia. It's not easy. And so when I got to be a teenager, my mother was always trying to watch out for things that might make it harder for me. And one of the things that she never wanted me to do was grow a beard. She didn't want me to look too Muslim. She didn't want me to look like my dad. Georgia is not a place that is kind. And so, about a year ago, someone started saying things about Muslim immigrants and their children. Started talking about what it means for this country when they come here. Now, I'd always listened to my mother. I'd always done my best. And I'd never grown a beard. But I've spent the last several years joining John Lewis on the road, speaking to kids, speaking to young adults, speaking to folks who are not so young. And over and over again, he tells us if you see something that's not right, if you see something that's not fair, that's not just, you have a moral obligation to get in the way, to do something about it, to speak up and to speak out. And in the process of making a march, I learned that nonviolence isn't always a protest. It isn't always a march. It isn't always civil disobedience. In many ways, the fullest expression of nonviolence is to educate and to sensitize your fellow human beings about who we are and where we come from. And so when I started hearing those things, I couldn't do nothing. So I called my mom. And I told her, I'm sorry, but I'm going to grow a beard. She was not happy, but... You know, I work on Capitol Hill. I've been there for over 10 years. It is a very white male place. There are not very many people who have a background such as mine, or in many ways, a background such as many of us here. And so I was trying to sensitize and educate my colleagues. I was trying to show them that I have made a contribution, that what they were saying about Muslim immigrants was not true. That in fact, those of us who were raised here in Georgia, I was raised Methodist. I went to a Presbyterian school. I went to a Jesuit grad school. But they're going to judge me because of who my father was. A man who I did not know. A man whose name I carry every day. So I started speaking out about it. My mother got a phone call from my aunt. There was a news story. My mother said, you know, I heard from your Aunt Patty that she saw on the Facebook that you still have your beard. I say, yeah, it's true. But I couldn't do nothing, you know? So here we are, and that's why I have a beard. Because I noticed you had the pictures. Now, how did we get here? Well, it all started in 2008. I was serving on the Congressman's campaign staff. I was serving as his press secretary, and it was coming down to the end of the campaign, right? 2008 was the summer of hope and change. Barack Obama was sweeping through the Democratic primaries. People were starting to ask, how do we interact with our elected officials? How can we do it differently? How can we be better? How can we interact with young people, get them involved in the political process? And so as we came down to the end of the campaign, folks started talking about what they were going to do afterwards. Some folks said they were going to go to the beach. Some folks said they were going to go see their parents. I said I was going to a comic book convention. That has always been my refuge, if I am totally honest. There's not a lot of places where you can go and see people overcome being powerless, where you can read stories about individuals who care about justice for the sake of being just. So that's always where I've gone. Except that day, when I told everybody on this very political staff, they all laughed at me, except for one person. I heard a deep voice say, "Don't laugh." There was a comic book during the movement, and it was very influential. And it was John Lewis standing up for me as he stood up for so many of us. Well, I wanted to know more about this, so I kept asking questions, and he told me it was a comic book called Martin Luther King and the Montgomery Story. So I went home that night, I looked it up on the internet, I read it, and I was amazed. It was beautiful. 16 pages cover to cover, sold for 10 cents. Talked about Gandhi and Dr. King and Rosa Parks, and how the Montgomery bus boycott worked to bring nonviolence into the public lexicon. How they succeeded. And how nonviolence can be used to succeed again. Now, I was 24 years old. I didn't know any better. And it just seemed self-evident to me. Here I'd spent this summer watching John Lewis tell these stories of his own involvement as a young person, as chairman of SNCC, an organization that, having grown up in Atlanta, having grown up in Georgia, a place where it was headquartered, I'd never heard stories about it. Nobody told me what the young people did. And so when I watched John Lewis tell these stories, and I watched young people's face light up, and then I heard about that comic book, I had a moment. And I thought, John Lewis should write a comic book. And so the next day I went into the office. And when it came up, how do we reach young people? I was there, waving my hand, saying, I think you should write a comic book. He was so sweet. He said, oh, maybe. Which if you work in politics, you'll find real quick that maybe is a really nice way of saying no. But I couldn't give up on the idea. It meant too much to me. It seemed so important. These stories mean something. They are a path forward. A way for all of us who grow up young and frustrated, who feel powerless. It's a way out. It's a liberation. Much like, if I'm totally honest, the library was to me. Because when you grow up poor, there's nowhere else to go. It's the only place you can see these stories. It's the only place that you can use the internet, or read magazines, or the newspaper, or a John Grisham book, which I looked pretty strange carrying around in the 4th grade, but I was a strange kid. And so I kept asking, and I asked, and my colleagues, they all laughed at me, sort of called me comic book boy. Didn't make sense to them, but that's okay. Until one day when I asked again, the congressman said, okay, I'll do it, but only if you write it with me. And that moment changed my life. Well, it's been 8 years and some change since that day. And the process of making March is something that I couldn't have foreseen. It was nights and weekends for years. It was an uphill battle from the very beginning. Congressman has a day job, so there wasn't a lot of time, so it meant we spent nights and weekends giving everything we had. Sometimes we'd call each other on the phone, I'd interview him, I'd have questions about what happened, or who was that, or I read this somewhere. Sometimes he would fall asleep on the phone, sometimes I would fall asleep on the phone. It's actually kind of adorable. I went back and looked at the recordings, and you just sort of hear, and then the recording ends, you know. And we did this for years. Because at first, none of the publishers thought it would work. They said, oh, that's a nice idea, kid. Good luck. But we kept pushing and we kept working. Actually, I got to go on the pilgrimage with the congressman where he takes members down to Alabama and shows them the sights, tells them the stories. And I got on an elevator, and there was John Siegenthaler, who was the publisher of the Nashville Tennessean and Robert Kennedy's aide. He's in book 2. And he was with Ethel Kennedy, Robert Kennedy's widow. And I got on the elevator, and you know, young and sort of silly. And I said, excuse me, I just thought y'all might want to know, you're in a comic book that I'm working on with John Lewis? And Ethel Kennedy looks up at me with these big, beautiful eyes. She says, well, that's nice, dear. So you can understand what it meant to me when she called a few years later to tell us that March Book 1 was the first graphic novel ever to win the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award. But that wasn't the moment that we knew March was going to be more than a graphic novel, more than a book, that it would be a source of inspiration for an entire generation. That moment came when I got a phone call from a reporter at a conservative newspaper that shall remain nameless. And he said, man, I got an advance copy of your book, and I loved it. And honestly, I don't usually do this, but I loved it so much I gave it to my 9-year-old son. And I got to tell you, he read it. And now he's gone, he's put on his Sunday suit, he's marching around my house demanding equality for everyone. Imagine if we could instill a social consciousness in every 9-year-old in America. This country would be a different place in a generation. The Southern Poverty Law Center gave it a name. It's called the 9-word problem. The vast majority of students who graduate from high school in the United States only know 9 words about the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, I have a dream. That's it. And that's a shame. How can you understand the politics of today? All the terrible things being said, the division being sown. How can you understand that if you don't understand the civil rights movement? So many of these fault lines were created in response to the success of the young people during the civil rights movement. And I argue that today we need another activist generation. We need a generation that comes out of college just like John Lewis did, that missed his graduation so that he could be in Parchman Penitentiary on the Freedom Rides. I mentioned earlier that I serve as digital director, which in a sense means I tweet for a living. And one of the things I like to ask students as I go speak to them is, what would Dr. King have tweeted? What would Gandhi post? How would these leaders have used these unbelievable tools that we now have at our disposal to organize? How would they have used them to get people to show up? I think sometimes we all feel like there is an armchair activist culture where people like to use these tools to express their opinion, but they're not using them to put pressure on their elected officials, on their government, to change and to change their policies. I think we have to give them the freedom to do that. And we have to do that by lifting the burden of student loan debt. Imagine if John Lewis, or Diane Nash, or Bernard Lafayette, or James Bevel, or C.T. Vivian. Imagine any of these people graduated from college and they had to go work at a corporation at a time when African Americans were making far less than whites. Imagine if they had to go and make money to pay off this debt. There would have been no Civil Rights Act. There would have been no Voting Rights Act, because the activists who made that generation possible, those advances possible, would have been servicing their debt. Put it to you another way. When John Lewis got married in 1969, the wedding announcement read, "Lillian Miles to wed unemployed political activist John Lewis." People who are ahead of their time pay a price. And we have to lift the burden of debt so that this generation is free to pay that price for us. And I'll be totally honest, we used to have something like that in this state. It was called hope. Now it's loans. And that was a great tragedy. But we can make it happen again. If I'm totally honest, I've taken a leave of absence from the congressional office, and I'm down here pitching in for Secretary Clinton. Now, I won't go too political, because we're here at a library event, but I'm just curious, how many of you have early voted? That's good, but that's not enough. Every person has to vote. John Lewis fought too hard and too long for each and every one of us to have the right to vote, and we must use it. So I'm young. I'm 33. I'm giving my time, I'm giving my effort, I'm giving my energy. I haven't slept very much in the last few months. First we were on the road with March for the summer. Then we were in session, trying to get things done before Congress recessed before this election. And then I packed my bags and I came home. I love this place. It got me through. It got me out. It helped me grow up. But I want every person to have the opportunities that I did. I'm a 6'3" whitish male. I have a lot of privilege. And there are a lot of people who don't have the same privilege that I do. And I have a moral obligation to use that privilege to help others. We all do. No one's the strongest and no one is the weakest among us. And so we have to bring those people who've been left out and left behind, we have to bring them with us. Let me tell you one more story. When I was in high school, I would bring comic books with me. I'd read them when we had time. And one time I had them out on my desk during English class. And my English teacher came by and she saw them and she took them away. She said, "I'm sorry you can't have those out. Those aren't real books." Well, I got to go back to my high school with Congressman Lewis. And I got to have a wonderful conversation with that very same English teacher about her experiences teaching our graphic novels. I tell you this story not as any form of comeuppance to the teacher. She's doing the Lord's work, and frankly, she was expressing the prevailing wisdom of the time. But I offer it as an example of the power of an idea whose time has come, and the brief period with which change is possible. So I ask all of you, join us. March. Thank you. So I think we've got time to take 1 or 2 questions. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Lewis, are you going to, it's an awesome place to meet you, sir. I've been following you for many years. Are you going to write a different book for us?
Well, you know,
We didn't hear the question.
She asked if we're going to write another book.
a book 4.
Book 4.
Well, there may be, we can get it out.
Yeah.
Book 4, book 5, whatever.
I think young people are responding to this in a way. Yeah, we've done 3, and I think using the graphic novel format to talk about the 60s is something that people are gravitating to in a way we couldn't possibly have imagined. And there's so much to tell after Selma. So we'll see. Thank you. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Yes. First of all, thank you both for being here, and mad respect to both of you gentlemen, Congressman, for all your work. The question I had was, what can we do to further push? I feel like the one portion of the country that doesn't have lobbyists or anyone fighting for them in Washington is hard. You know, I know you are one who fights for people in poverty and the poor. What can we do more to further push an agenda that helps the vast majority of this country and the poor in particular?
Well, I must tell you, sometimes I feel like we're too quiet, just too quiet. And sometimes you need to make a little noise, or find a way to, what I call, get in the way. Find a way to dramatize it. I moved to Atlanta in 1963, 23 years old, and I became a member of Dr. King's father church, Daddy King, Ebenezer Baptist Church. And sometime I would go there, and young Martin Luther King Jr. would be preaching. And Daddy King would be in the audience, or maybe in the pulpit, and he would say things like, "Make it plain, son, make it plain." As citizens, we need to find ways and means to make it plain, to make it simple, to help educate, to help inspire another generation of people to stand up, to speak up. And Andrew used a line that I use all the time. When I said, when you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, you have to do something. You cannot afford to be quiet. Now, we wanted the majority party in the House to do something about gun violence. We don't want to take away people's Second Amendment right, but there are people that shouldn't have guns. Shouldn't have guns. Too many, we're losing too many children. Too many mass murders in theaters, classroom in Connecticut, a school, all this. I couldn't get up to go to work that day. I was so sad and hurt seeing all of these little children mowed down, first, second, and third grade. So you have to do something, you have to say something. If the majority party had brought a bill to the floor of the House, we would have passed it. So sometimes you have to stand up by sitting down. And you have social media today, use it. Use it for good. We didn't have a website during the 60s. Hadn't heard of the internet. Facebook, what is that?
One last question.
There's such divisiveness in Washington that's gotten to the point of hate. And it doesn't seem to me it's going to change from the top down. What can we do at this level to begin to erase that kind of divisiveness that's created so much gridlock and, quite frankly, so much hatred?
Well, first of all, I think we all have to just, I talk to my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, and I call them brother, sister, and sometimes I say, your mother didn't teach you that. You really don't believe that, do you? And I said, Brother Paul, Sister Louise, you know, we got to work together for the common good. But I think it's in your hand. You have to step out there and say something and do something. And you have the power of the vote. Andrew, you want to respond?
I think we've gone too far with redistricting. Redistricting. The fact that Georgia is in its most extreme year a 55-45 state, and yet you only have 4 Democratic members of Congress and 10 Republicans. They're all playing to their base, and it's not evenly represented. The ability to have a 50-50 district does not exist anymore. Why can our elected officials not stand by their ideas? Why do they have to hide in safe districts? The congressman openly pushed to make his district more diverse, but the others hide behind these redistricted lines. The voters don't pick their elected officials, the elected officials pick their voters. And we have to change that, and you have to hold each one, the governor, the state legislature, everyone on the redistricting commission. I worked with John Lewis on the 2010 redistricting going into 2012, and his testimony said that it was the resegregation of the state of Georgia, and that's what it was. And until we do something about that, until we show all of these people who go down to the state capitol and say, you know what, I only want to represent these people, until we make them stop that, we're going to continue to have to deal with that in Georgia. But you have the power to make them do that. If we win Georgia, if we take this state, they will have to check that and make a substantial change when they come back.